Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. I'm Reverend Matt. I'm the Connectionalist, and today I'm asking you, are you stuck or have you ever been stuck on the book of Leviticus? Have you ever gotten there in your Bible reading and been like, I don't care about what's going on here. I don't know what's going on here. What's the point for me as a modern Christian? Well, there's a lot there for us to unpack and understand in order to understand our place as Christians. And so the Bible Project is going to take us through that today as a part of our commentary on the Bible series. So let's go ahead and get started.
The book of Leviticus. It's the third book of the Bible, and it's set right after the exodus of the Israelites from their slavery, when God brought them to the foot of Mount Sinai and invited Israel into a covenant relationship. Now, they had quickly rebelled and broke that covenant. And
Right.
God had wanted for his glorious presence to come and live right in the midst of Israel in the form of this tabernacle. But Israel's sin has damaged the relationship. So, at the end of the previous book, Exodus, Moses, as Israel's representative, could not even enter God's presence in the tent.
Right.
The book of Leviticus opens by reminding us of this fundamental problem. It says, "The Lord called to Moses from the tent." So the question is, how can Israel, in their sin and selfishness, be reconciled to this holy God?
So Leviticus is going to be a setup of the Mosaic code that allows the Israelites and later the Jews to reconnect with God and to absolve themselves of sin under the law. And then when we get to places in the New Testament where Paul talks about the law being a placeholder and being there for our good until Jesus, it's hard to understand that unless you understand this. That's why it's important.
That's what this book is all about, how God is graciously providing a way
Right.
for sinful, corrupt people to live in his holy presence. Now, let's pause for a second and explore this really important idea that God is holy. It's fundamental to understanding this book. The word holy means simply to be set apart or unique. And in the Bible, God is set apart from all other things because of his unique role as the creator of all, as the author of life
Right.
itself. And
He's
so
God,
if God
so he's holy.
is holy,
Yep.
then the space around God is also holy. It's full of his goodness and his life and purity and justice. So if Israel, who is unjust and sinful, wants to live in God's holy presence, they too need to become holy.
Need to be
Their
made
sin
holy.
has
Right.
to be dealt with. Thus, the book of Leviticus. Now, the book has a really amazing symmetrical design. It explores the three main ways that God helps Israel to live in his presence. The outer sections are descriptions of the rituals Israel was to practice in God's holy presence. The next,
And we still use ritual, right? A lot of people are like, oh, Christianity is not a religion, it's a relationship. And that's actually like a really bad way to think about it because there is a lot of ritual that's a part of the Christian faith. And yes, there's a relationship with God and a relationship with Jesus that comes with it, but this rejection of religion and ritual in Christianity is a modern thing that's not healthy for Christianity. We still use ritual. We have the Holy Eucharist, right? We have baptism. We still have ritual as a way of reconnecting ourselves to God, even in Christianity.
intersections focus on the role of Israel's priests as mediators between God and Israel.
Right.
And inside of that
So
are
we
two
see
matching
the
sections
beginning
that
of
focus
priests.
on Israel's purity. And then right here at the center of the book, there's a key ritual, the Day of Atonement, that brings the whole book together. The book concludes with a short section where Moses calls on Israel to be faithful to this covenant. Let's dive into the book. The first section explores the 5 main types of ritual sacrifices that
Right.
Israel was
So we're going to use animal sacrifice.
2 of these were ways that
Or
an
grain.
Israelite could say
Right.
thank you to God by offering back to God these symbolic tokens of what God has first given them. 3 other sacrifices were different ways of saying sorry to God. So
It's a good way to put
an
it.
Israelite would offer up the lifeblood of an animal while confessing that their sin has created more evil and death in God's good world. But instead of destroying this person, God, of course, wants to forgive them. And so this
Right.
animal symbolically dies in their place and atones, which means it covers for their sin. And so through these rituals, the Israelites were constantly being reminded of God's grace, but also of his justice and of the seriousness of their evil and its consequences.
Yeah, giving up like an unblemished lamb, for instance, as sacrifice, and you see it there on the altar being sacrificed. It does. It's a way of reminding that, you know, it's a way of remembering God's mercy and God's justice, and it's like a very visual reminder. I could see that I could see how that would be very helpful And in a way, we still talk about sacrifice at the Lord's table, right? We still talk about Jesus as the sacrifice for the sins of humanity, right? Especially when we come to the Lord's table. And so it's important that you understand how we got there. That wasn't theology that just fell out of the sky that Paul invented. This is a natural progression from the beginning.
The second set of rituals lays out the 7 annual feasts of Israel. And each of these retold a different part of the story about how God redeemed them from slavery in Egypt and brought them through the wilderness on their way to the Promised Land. And by celebrating these feasts regularly, Israel would remember who they were and who God was to them. Now, the sections about Israel's priests, you have Aaron and his sons first ordained to enter into God's presence on behalf of Israel.
So we see the beginning of this idea of priests, or a group of people set apart, right? In Christianity, we think all people are priests in the sense that all people have access to God, but we still have ordained priests and presbyters set aside for the work of ministry. I'm one of those, right? So I'm ordained. So what's happened is everybody's called to ministry, but there are some people from the very beginning that the church, through the calling of God, has set apart to order the life of the church for the rest of the body, right? The rest of the church body, and going back to earlier, says, okay, we need a certain amount of people that we set aside to keep these traditions, to order them for the good of all of us, right? And so that is the call to ministry, essentially. And we see the beginning of that idea of the ordination, right? That we're going to take these people and we're going to set them apart, not above, not below, apart, to do that work on behalf of the whole community.
And then in this matching section, we find the qualifications for being a priest.
Right.
The priests were
Which
called
we still
to
have.
the highest level of moral integrity and ritual holiness.
Still true.
Because they represented the people.
We're still people, but we are called to that, yeah.
Before God, but then also represented God to the people. Now, we find out why the priest's holiness matters so much back here in this first section. Right after the family of Aaron was ordained, 2 of his sons waltz right into God's presence and flagrantly violate the rule.
Not good.
And so they are consumed by God's holiness on the spot. It's a haunting reminder of the paradox of living in God's holy presence, because it's pure goodness, but it becomes dangerous to those who rebel and insult God's holiness.
Yeah.
And so it's important that
That's important to understand the story and understand the meaning of a story like that, right? Is to see that this is how serious God takes the holiness aspect, how serious God takes being flippant about approaching God and dealing with those things.
Israel's priests become holy, and also that all of the people of Israel become holy, which is what the next intersections are all about. Chapters 11 through 15 are about the ritual purity required of all the Israelites, and chapters 18 through 20 are about the moral purity of the people. Here's what's underneath all of this purity and impurity language. Mm-hmm. Because God is holy and he's set apart, the Israelites need to be in a state of holiness themselves when they enter into his presence.
Right.
This was called being clean or pure.
Clean.
God's presence was...
So you see the cleanliness laws, right? Like, if you touch somebody who is dead, right, you're unclean for a certain amount of days, right? This was the idea to protect purity and cleanliness so that people could approach God.
Off limits to anybody who was not in a holy state, and this was called being unclean or impure. Now, an Israelite could become impure in just a few ways.
Right.
By contact with reproductive body fluids,
fair.
By having a skin disease, by touching
leprosy,
mold or fungus, or...
This is why, this is why it's so shocking when Jesus in the New Testament touches lepers, right, and engages with them, because they're unclean, right? And Jesus says, I make you clean, right? I am the God of life. I say what's clean and unclean, right? And that is that's like a new thing God is doing through the incarnation, right? Is saying, okay, all these things don't have to be here anymore because the God of all life is here and has come and is going to make all things right.
Or by touching a dead body. Now, for the Israelites, all of these were associated with mortality, with the loss of life,
right,
which gets us to the core symbol of all these ideas. You become impure when you're contaminated by touching death so to speak. And
And it's easy to see how some of these would have come into fruition in the community too, because a lot of them are how disease spreads, right? And they wouldn't have known about germ theory, of course, but they did probably understand that, like, oh, the dead can carry disease, right? If you touch a leper, you could become infected, right? If you're touching mold or things that are unclean, right, you can get sick that way. They at least understood that, and so that was a part of what was going on too.
death is the opposite of God's holiness because God's essence is life. Now, this is really key. Simply being impure was not sinful or
Correct.
wrong. Touching
That's really important to understand, is that impurity under this code is not, people would become impure all the time. It's like, oh, okay, you have to bury this person who's dead. You have to touch them. Okay, well, somebody has to do that, but they're just unclean for 7 days. They do the right things, and then they're back into a state of cleanliness. It was something you entered and exited throughout your life.
these kinds of things was a normal part of everyday life.
Right.
And impurity was a temporary state. It just
Right.
lasted a week or two, and then it
Unless you were a leper, and then it was a permanent state, which is where Jesus had issue, right? Because he was trying to get people to understand how they were supposed to be thinking about that.
it's over. What was wrong or sinful was to waltz into God's presence carrying these symbols of death and impurity on my body. Don't do that. Now, the last way of becoming impure was by eating certain animals, and the
Right.
kosher food laws are found right here in this section. Now, there have been lots of theories about why certain animals were considered impure and off limits.
The ones that carry disease, I that's the theory that I like the most. It makes the most sense of why God would reveal that to them, right? And to say, hey, these are the ones you should stay away from. You can carry disease from this. But then by the time, of course, we get to the book of Acts, right, we see a change in the way that food is approached, explained in the book of Acts.
To promote hygiene or to avoid cultural taboos. The text just isn't explicit.
It
But the
isn't,
basic
but
point of all of
hygiene
these
makes a lot of
chapters
sense.
is really clear. Altogether, these work as an elaborate set of cultural symbols that reminds Israel that God's holiness was to affect all areas of their lives.
That's probably the most important piece, right? Is that they're supposed to be different. Israel, the people of God, are supposed to be different. And if they do some of these things that are kind of different compared to the rest of the nations around them, that will help remind them that they are set apart, that they're different, and God wants them to be different. And so they need tangible ways to remember how different they are.
This corresponding section over here is about Israel's moral purity. The Israelites were called to live differently than the Canaanites. They were to care for the poor instead of overlooking them. They were to have a high level of sexual integrity, and they were to promote justice throughout their entire land. Now, here at the center of the book, we find a long description of one of Israel's annual feasts, the Day of Atonement. Odds are that not every Israelite's sin and rebellion would be covered through the individual sacrifices. And so once a year, the high priest would take 2 goats. One of these would become a purification offering and atone for the sins of the people. And the other was called the scapegoat. The priest would confess the sins of Israel and symbolically place them on this goat, and then it would be cast out into the wilderness.
Yep.
Again, this is a very powerful image of God's desire to remove sin and its consequences from his people.
It's a tangible
so that
way
God
to help
can live
people
with them in peace.
understand.
The book concludes with Moses calling Israel to be faithful to all of the terms of the covenant. And he describes the blessings of peace and abundance that will result if Israel obeys all of these laws. He also warns them that if they're unfaithful and dishonor God's holiness, it will result in disaster and
Which is what happens.
ultimately exile from the land promised to Abraham.
Right.
Now,
Which is what happens. They get exiled. Few centuries later, they're exiled from the land of Israel.
Now, if you want to see how Leviticus fits into the big storyline, it's helpful to look at the first sentence of the next book of the Bible, Numbers. It
Which we'll get
begins,
to.
The Lord spoke to Moses in the tent. So we can see that Moses is now able to enter God's presence on behalf of Israel. The book of Leviticus, it worked.
The Hebrew, it says, God says, Moses, I speak to face, or I think the Hebrew word is, I can't really remember, because Peniel in Genesis is the face of God, El being God, and Pen being like face. But I believe the word that's used, we always translate it face to face, but the word can also mean mouth. So it's like, I speak to Moses mouth to mouth or face to face. It's this more kind of intimate connection that God has with Moses that nobody else is privy to.
So, despite Israel's failure, God has provided a way for their sin to be covered so that God can live with sinful people in peace. And that's what the book of Leviticus is all about.
Okay, very, very important. So, don't get caught up in memorizing all the like Levitical codes and stuff, because Christians all obviously don't live by that. What's important, the important message from Leviticus is God is merciful, God is gracious, God does whatever it takes in order to be in relationship with the people. And if you're gonna understand Christianity, you have to understand this section. And you don't always have to like memorize each piece of it, but really go in there, look at the sections, understand what's going on, understand what God is trying to do, and understand the overall message, because it's a part of the bigger story that makes the New Testament story much more meaningful when you understand. And so that's really important. So Bible Project, as always, great job. Make sure you go like and subscribe to them. They do just an excellent job providing this material for us to learn from. And if you like my commentary today, make sure you like and subscribe to my channel as well. That's the best way that you can help a young channel like mine. But until next time, I'm River Matt, and I'm the Connectionalist. I'll see you again. Bye-bye.